Everyone knows by now that the independent pathologist never examined the front of Nolan Wells's neck. But that's not the real question. The real question is this: could that one missing piece of forensic evidence have prevented the family's independent pathologist from fully determining how Nolan Wells died? Because according to forensic experts, that single limitation may be the reason manual strangulation still cannot be ruled out. And if that's true, then one of the most important questions in this entire investigation may still be unanswered. Today, we're breaking down the forensic science, the autopsy findings, and the expert opinions to understand why this case continues to divide both investigators and the public. Not to prove one theory, not to dismiss another, but to follow the evidence and determine why, months later, some forensic experts still believe the possibility of strangulation deserves careful consideration. If you appreciate evidence-based true crime coverage that looks beyond the headlines, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications. Here on Midnight True Crime, we don't rush to conclusions. We examine the evidence, separate confirmed facts from speculation, and break down the forensic science in a way that's easy to understand. Now, let's begin where this controversy truly started. Long before forensic experts began debating the possibility of strangulation, one statement shaped the entire public narrative. Just days after Nolan Wells' body was recovered from the waters near Horn Island, officials publicly announced that they believed there was no foul play involved. For many people following the case, that statement seemed to answer the biggest question before the investigation had even fully unfolded. But here's why that announcement has continued to spark debate. At the time those comments were made, the complete autopsy process had not yet been finished. Toxicology results were still pending, and the detailed forensic examination that ultimately determines a cause and manner of death had not reached its conclusion. That doesn't necessarily mean the officials acted improperly. Law enforcement can share preliminary observations during an active investigation. But in a case as complex as this, where a body had spent days in the water, many forensic professionals believe extreme caution is essential before drawing definitive conclusions. And that's because recovering a body from water presents unique challenges. Unlike what many people assume, finding someone in the water does not automatically mean they drowned. In forensic pathology, investigators must determine whether the water was actually the cause of death, or simply the place where the body was ultimately found. That distinction may sound small, but it changes everything. Because if investigators begin with the assumption that a drowning occurred, there's a risk that other possibilities may not receive the same level of scrutiny. Forensic pathology is designed to work in the opposite direction. The evidence is examined first, every reasonable possibility is considered, and only then is a final conclusion reached. It's that process, and whether it was followed carefully enough in Nolan Wells's case, that has become one of the biggest points of discussion among forensic experts and members of the public alike. To understand why, we first need to understand one of the most misunderstood concepts in forensic medicine: why drowning is known as a diagnosis of exclusion. To understand why forensic experts began asking new questions, we first have to understand one of the most misunderstood concepts in death investigations. When most people hear that a body was found in the water, they naturally assume the person drowned. But in forensic pathology, that's not how the process works. In fact, drowning is what's known as a diagnosis of exclusion. That means a medical examiner cannot simply conclude that someone drowned because they were recovered from a lake, river, or ocean. Instead, every other reasonable cause of death must first be considered and, if the evidence allows, ruled out. Think of it like solving a puzzle. Investigators don't start with an answer and then search for evidence to support it. They start with the evidence itself. They examine the body for signs of trauma. They look for injuries to the head, the chest, and the neck. They study the toxicology results. They review the circumstances surrounding the person's final hours. Only after every other reasonable explanation has been carefully examined can drowning be identified as the cause of death. That's why forensic experts often describe drowning as a diagnosis reached at the end of an investigation, not the beginning. One board-certified forensic pathologist who reviewed the public information surrounding Nolan Wells's case explained exactly this point. According to the expert, a body recovered from water could represent several different scenarios. A person may have drowned. A person may have died from natural causes before entering the water. Or a person may have suffered a fatal injury elsewhere and later been placed in the water. The presence of water alone cannot answer that question. That's precisely why experienced forensic pathologists are often careful about reaching conclusions too early, especially when a body has been submerged for several days. Time changes evidence, water changes evidence, and decomposition can erase or obscure injuries that might otherwise have been obvious during a fresh examination. In Nolan Wells's case, those challenges became even greater because his body wasn't recovered immediately. By the time forensic examinations began, decomposition had already started, making the job of determining exactly what happened significantly more difficult. None of this proves that Nolan did not drown, but it does explain why many forensic professionals believe that a careful, methodical examination was essential before any definitive conclusion could be reached. And that brings us to perhaps the most important development in this entire investigation. When Nolan's family requested an independent autopsy, they hoped a second forensic examination would either confirm the official conclusions or uncover something that had been missed. Instead, the independent pathologist discovered there was one crucial part of Nolan's body that he couldn't examine at all. When Nolan's family requested an independent autopsy, they weren't necessarily expecting a completely different conclusion. Like many families searching for answers, they simply wanted a second set of expert eyes to examine the evidence. Independent autopsies are common in high-profile cases, particularly when loved ones still have unanswered questions or want additional reassurance that every possibility has been thoroughly considered. To conduct that examination, the family retained renowned civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump, who helped arrange for an independent forensic review by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist. The purpose of that examination wasn't to prove one theory over another. It was to independently evaluate the available evidence and determine whether the medical findings supported the conclusions that had already been discussed publicly. But almost immediately, the independent examination ran into an unexpected obstacle. Dr. Mitchell did not have access to every part of Nolan's body. According to statements made during the family's press conference, one specific section had been retained by the state medical examiner's office before the body was released to the family. That section was the front of the neck, often referred to in forensic pathology as the neck block. At first glance, that might not sound significant. After all, medical examiners sometimes retain tissue samples during an active investigation. It's a well-established forensic practice, used for additional testing, microscopic examination, or to preserve potential evidence. On its own, the decision to retain tissue does not indicate wrongdoing or foul play. But what made this particular situation different was which tissue had been retained. The neck block contains some of the most important anatomical structures a forensic pathologist examines when evaluating the possibility of manual strangulation. Without that portion of the neck, the independent examiner was unable to personally inspect the very area where injuries associated with compression of the neck would most commonly be found. That limitation didn't prove Nolan had been strangled. It also didn't prove he hadn't. Instead, it created something investigators and forensic experts dislike more than almost anything else: an unanswered question. Because in forensic medicine, the absence of evidence is not always evidence that something never happened. Sometimes, it's simply evidence that a particular finding couldn't be independently evaluated. And that's exactly why this missing section of anatomy has become the centerpiece of so much public discussion. If the independent pathologist couldn't examine the structures most relevant to a potential strangulation, what exactly was contained in the tissue that remained with the state medical examiner? Was it retained simply as part of routine procedure? Or could it contain findings that only the official autopsy has documented? At this point, no public evidence answers those questions definitively. But understanding why the neck matters requires a closer look at the anatomy itself. Because hidden inside that small section of the human body are several structures that forensic pathologists rely on when determining whether pressure was ever applied to a person's neck, and those structures could play a crucial role in understanding what happened to Nolan Wells. To understand why forensic experts continue discussing the retained neck block, you first have to understand what makes the front of the neck so important in a death investigation. Different causes of death leave evidence in different parts of the body. A gunshot wound leaves its own unmistakable signs. Blunt force trauma creates another pattern. Drowning has its own forensic indicators. And when investigators are evaluating the possibility of manual strangulation, they focus on one specific area more than any other: the front of the neck. That's because some of the body's most delicate and important structures are located there. One of those structures is a small horseshoe-shaped bone called the hyoid bone. Unlike most bones in the human body, the hyoid isn't connected directly to any other bone. Instead, it sits high in the neck, supported by muscles and ligaments. Because of its location, forensic pathologists routinely examine it whenever there's a question about compression of the neck. In some cases of manual strangulation, the hyoid bone may fracture under pressure. In many other cases, it remains completely intact. That's why a broken hyoid bone alone doesn't prove strangulation, and an intact hyoid doesn't automatically rule it out. It's only one piece of a much larger forensic picture. Experts also examine the strap muscles, a group of thin muscles running along the front of the neck. If significant pressure is applied, tiny blood vessels within these muscles can rupture, leaving microscopic hemorrhages that may not be visible from the outside. Those subtle findings often require careful internal examination and, in some cases, laboratory analysis. Another important finding is something called petechiae. Petechiae are tiny pinpoint hemorrhages that can appear in the eyes, eyelids, face, or other tissues when pressure interferes with normal blood flow. They're one of several findings forensic pathologists may consider during an investigation. However, petechiae are not unique to strangulation and must always be interpreted alongside every other medical finding. This is why forensic pathology is based on patterns, not isolated observations. A single finding rarely answers the question. Instead, medical examiners look at the totality of the evidence. They compare injuries, microscopic tissue changes, toxicology, scene evidence, witness statements, and the circumstances surrounding the death before reaching a conclusion. That's what makes the retained neck block so significant in the public discussion surrounding Nolan Wells's case. According to the family's independent forensic expert, the very area containing many of these critical anatomical structures wasn't available for examination during the second autopsy. As a result, the independent pathologist couldn't personally evaluate whether those tissues showed signs consistent with compression of the neck, or whether they showed no such signs at all. That distinction is incredibly important. It doesn't mean those findings exist. It doesn't mean they don't. It simply means the independent examiner was unable to reach his own conclusion about one of the most medically significant areas of Nolan's body, because that portion had remained with the state medical examiner's office. And that leads to the next question that continues to divide public opinion. If the independent autopsy couldn't fully examine the structures most relevant to a potential strangulation, what conclusion was the pathologist actually able to reach? The answer surprised many people following the case. After completing his examination, Dr. Roger Mitchell did not conclude that Nolan Wells had died from drowning, but he also did not conclude that Nolan had been strangled. Instead, he reached a conclusion that, in forensic pathology, often carries more weight than many people realize: undetermined. At first glance, that word can sound frustratingly vague. To some people, it feels like a non-answer. To others, it sounds like investigators simply couldn't make up their minds. But that's not what it means. In forensic medicine, an undetermined manner or cause of death reflects the evidence that is available. It means the medical findings do not allow the examiner to confidently support one explanation while ruling out all other reasonable possibilities. In other words, it isn't a guess. It's an acknowledgement of the limits of the evidence. For many forensic pathologists, saying, "I don't know," when the evidence doesn't support certainty, is far more scientifically responsible than reaching a conclusion that cannot be fully defended. That's why Dr. Mitchell's findings attracted so much attention. While some officials had publicly expressed confidence that there was no foul play, the independent examination stopped short of making that same determination. Instead, it recognized that unanswered questions still remained. One of the biggest reasons for that uncertainty was the limitation placed on the independent examination itself. As we've already discussed, Dr. Mitchell did not have the opportunity to examine the retained neck block, the very area where some of the most important forensic evidence in a potential strangulation case could be located. Without that tissue, there was no way for him to independently determine whether the neck showed injuries consistent with compression or whether it showed no injuries at all. And that distinction matters, because forensic pathology isn't about proving a theory. It's about eliminating possibilities until only one explanation remains. If one of the most significant anatomical regions can't be independently evaluated, that naturally limits how definitive an examiner's conclusions can be. There's another factor that complicated the investigation even further. By the time the independent autopsy was performed, Nolan's body had already spent several days in the water, undergone recovery, and been examined once before. Every passing hour changes the condition of the body. Soft tissue begins to break down. Microscopic evidence becomes more difficult to interpret. Natural decomposition can obscure injuries that may have been easier to identify immediately after death. That doesn't mean evidence disappears completely, but it does mean forensic experts must be even more cautious about drawing firm conclusions. It's one of the reasons experienced pathologists often emphasize patience in complex death investigations. They wait for microscopic examinations. They wait for toxicology. They wait for laboratory testing. And only then do they determine whether the evidence supports one conclusion over another. In Nolan Wells's case, those unanswered questions continued to fuel public discussion, not because the independent autopsy proved strangulation, but because it couldn't definitively exclude it based on the evidence available for examination. And that brings us to another critical piece of the puzzle. Even if the neck couldn't be fully examined during the independent autopsy, investigators were still waiting on another category of evidence that could influence the final picture: the toxicology results. Because in a case involving water, decomposition, and the passage of time, even something as straightforward as a blood alcohol reading isn't always as simple as it appears. As investigators continued piecing together what happened to Nolan Wells, another key part of the investigation was still incomplete: the toxicology report. For many people, toxicology sounds like the one piece of evidence that can settle everything. If drugs or alcohol are found, the case must be solved. If nothing is found, then the answer must lie somewhere else. But forensic science is rarely that simple. In fact, one of the biggest misconceptions about toxicology is that every result tells investigators exactly what was in a person's system at the moment they died. That's not always true. According to forensic experts, bodies recovered from water, and especially those that have begun decomposing, present unique challenges during toxicological testing. As the body naturally breaks down, bacteria begin producing chemicals that weren't necessarily present before death. One of those chemicals can be alcohol. That means a blood alcohol level measured after recovery doesn't automatically prove someone had been drinking before they died. In some cases, decomposition itself can produce alcohol, making the results far more difficult to interpret. That's why forensic pathologists don't rely on a toxicology report alone. They examine where the samples came from, how long the body remained in the water, the degree of decomposition, and whether the findings are consistent with every other piece of evidence. It's a process that requires patience, not assumptions. The forensic pathologist who reviewed Nolan's case emphasized this exact point. If alcohol is eventually determined to have been present before death, that still doesn't automatically explain how someone died. A person can be intoxicated and accidentally drown. A person can also have alcohol in their system and die from an entirely different cause. Toxicology helps answer questions. It doesn't answer all of them. That's why experienced medical examiners never allow a single laboratory result to outweigh the totality of the evidence. They compare toxicology with the autopsy findings. They compare it with witness statements. They compare it with scene evidence. And only after every piece fits together do they reach a final medical opinion. When viewed alongside the retained neck block, the limitations of the independent autopsy, and the effects of decomposition, toxicology becomes just one part of a much larger puzzle, not the puzzle itself. Taken individually, none of these issues prove that Nolan Wells died from strangulation. But together, they explain why some forensic experts believe it would be premature to say every reasonable possibility has been eliminated. And perhaps that's the most important takeaway from this entire investigation. The debate isn't about replacing one official conclusion with another. It's about whether the available evidence is sufficient to confidently exclude every other explanation. That question continues to divide public opinion. But for forensic pathologists, opinions aren't what matter. Evidence is. And until every piece of that evidence has been fully understood, the conversation surrounding Nolan Wells' death is likely to continue. By now, it's probably clear why the Nolan Wells case continues to generate so much discussion. Not because the evidence conclusively proves one theory over another, but because several important questions remain unanswered. The early public statements from investigators suggested there was no foul play. The independent autopsy later concluded that the available evidence was insufficient to reach a definitive conclusion, classifying the manner of death as undetermined. Forensic experts reminded the public that drowning is a diagnosis of exclusion, not a conclusion reached simply because a body is recovered from water. They also pointed out that the independent pathologist couldn't examine the retained neck block, the very area where findings associated with manual strangulation, if present, would typically be evaluated. At the same time, decomposition complicated the investigation, making certain forensic findings more difficult to interpret and toxicology results more challenging to analyze. When those facts are viewed together, it's easier to understand why this case remains the subject of so much public interest. That doesn't mean Nolan Wells was strangled, and it doesn't mean he drowned. What it means is that forensic science demands evidence, not assumptions. Every conclusion must be supported by what can be demonstrated, not by what seems most likely. As more reports become available, and investigators continue reviewing every piece of evidence, there may eventually be greater clarity about what happened during Nolan's final moments. Until then, the questions surrounding this case are likely to remain. For Nolan's family, those questions are deeply personal. For investigators, they're part of an ongoing effort to establish the facts. And for the public, they serve as a reminder that complex death investigations are rarely as straightforward as they first appear. Perhaps the most important lesson from this case isn't about one theory or another. It's about the importance of allowing forensic science to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when the answers take time. For now, the official investigation continues. The retained neck tissue remains part of the forensic record, and the public still doesn't have every answer. Whether future findings change the understanding of Nolan Wells' death remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: as long as key questions remain unanswered, this case won't simply fade away. If you found this documentary informative, subscribe to Midnight True Crime and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We cover the facts, follow the evidence, and bring you the latest developments in the cases that matter most. And before you go, we'd like to hear from you. What do you think is the biggest unanswered question in the Nolan Wells investigation? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, please keep the discussion respectful. The headlines may fade, but the search for truth never ends. This is Midnight True Crime. We'll see you in the next investigation.